The transport shuttle descended through Earth's atmosphere with a whisper, its hull scarred by plasma burns and kinetic impacts that told stories of battles fought in distant star systems. Commander Sarah Chen pressed her face against the viewport, watching the familiar blue marble grow larger beneath them. 5 years. 5 long years since she had volunteered for the Terran Defense Initiative's most dangerous assignment, deep space reconnaissance behind enemy lines. The Zephyrian Empire had swept through human colonies like wildfire, their advanced technology and superior numbers crushing resistance with ease. Most humans who encountered their forces never lived to tell about it. Sarah had been one of the few who not only survived, but thrived in the chaos of interstellar warfare. She touched the scar that ran from her left temple to her jaw, a souvenir from her first encounter with a Zephyrian shock trooper. The alien's energy blade had nearly ended her career before it began, but she had adapted quickly. Too quickly for comfort, some said. The other humans in her unit had started calling her the Ghost after she single-handedly infiltrated a Zephyrian command ship and extracted intelligence that saved 3 colony worlds. The shuttle touched down at Luna Base with barely a vibration. Sarah gathered her few possessions and made her way to the airlock. Her military gear had been replaced with civilian clothes that felt strange after years in combat armor. The fabric seemed too soft, too vulnerable against her skin. "Commander Chen?" A young ensign stood at attention as she stepped onto the platform. He couldn't have been more than 20, his uniform crisp and unblemished. Sarah remembered being that young once before she learned that war changed everything it touched. "Just Sarah now," she said, shouldering her duffel bag. "My commission ended the moment I set foot on this station." The ensign looked confused, but led her through the corridors toward the civilian transport terminal. Other passengers gave her a wide berth, something in her posture or the way her eyes constantly scanned for threats, marking her as different. A predator among prey, though she tried to suppress those instincts. Earth had changed in her absence, but not as much as she had hoped. The news feeds still spoke of the Zephyrian threat in distant terms, as if the enemy were a minor inconvenience rather than an existential threat to human civilization. Politicians debated defensive strategies while Sarah had seen entire worlds burned to ash. The disconnect was jarring. Her childhood home looked exactly as she remembered it. The small suburban house with its white picket fence and carefully tended garden seemed like something from another universe. Her mother, Helen, opened the door before Sarah could knock. The older woman's eyes filled with tears as she pulled her daughter into a fierce embrace. "My little girl," Helen whispered. "You're finally home." Sarah stiffened at the words, but returned the hug. Little girl. She had commanded a strike team of hardened soldiers, survived in hostile environments for months at a time, and killed more enemies than she cared to count. But to her mother, she was still the 18-year-old who had left home full of patriotic fervor and naive dreams of glory. The dinner table conversation felt surreal. Her father, Robert, peppered her with questions about military life while carefully avoiding anything that might be classified. Her younger brother, David, had graduated college and started working at a tech company. Everything was normal, peaceful, ordinary. Sarah found herself struggling to relate to their concerns about mortgage rates and career advancement when she had spent the last 5 years worrying about survival. "So, what are your plans now?" her mother asked over dessert. "You could go back to school, maybe finish that art degree you were working on, or settle down, find a nice young man. You're still young enough to have children." Sarah nearly choked on her coffee. The idea of sitting in a classroom or dating seemed absurd after everything she had experienced. How could she explain that she had seen things that would give these suburban civilians nightmares for years, that she had become something harder and sharper than the girl who had left this house? "I'm not sure yet," she said diplomatically. "I need some time to adjust." Her father nodded knowingly. Transition can be difficult, but you'll figure it out. You always were our little problem solver. That night, Sarah lay in her childhood bed, staring at glow-in-the-dark stars she had stuck to the ceiling a decade ago. Every sound made her tense, her hand instinctively reaching for weapons that weren't there. The house was too quiet, too safe. She missed the constant hum of ship engines and the controlled chaos of a military vessel. The next morning, she walked through her old neighborhood, trying to recapture some sense of belonging. Children played in yards while their parents went about their daily routines, blissfully unaware that their entire way of life hung by a thread. Sarah had seen what happened when the Zephyrians reached populated worlds. The lucky ones died quickly. At the local coffee shop, she recognized several faces from high school. They greeted her with enthusiasm, eager to hear stories from her military service. But their questions revealed how little they understood about the reality of the war. "Did you meet any aliens?" asked Jenny Morrison, her old lab partner. "Were they as scary as they look on the news?" Sarah thought about the Zephyrian captain she had interrogated on Kepler 442c, how his compound eyes had reflected no mercy or compassion. How he had laughed when she asked about human prisoners, explaining that her species was considered vermin to be exterminated. "They're different from us," she said simply. "I bet you showed them what human women are made of," laughed Tom Bradley, her former prom date, "though I still can't picture little Sarah Chen as some kind of space warrior." Little Sarah. There was that phrase again, reducing 5 years of combat experience to childhood memories. She forced a smile and excused herself from the conversation. The job interviews were worse. Potential employers looked at her military record with a mixture of confusion and condescension. Her experience leading reconnaissance missions was dismissed as irrelevant to civilian work. Her tactical planning skills were seen as overkill for project management positions. Again and again, she heard variations of the same theme. "We're impressed by your service record, Miss Chen, but we're looking for someone with real-world experience." Real-world experience. As if fighting for humanity's survival in the depths of space was somehow less real than pushing papers in an office cubicle. The Veterans Support Group was no better. Most of the other attendees were men who had served in conventional military roles, and they treated her with barely concealed skepticism. When she mentioned her service with the Deep Space Reconnaissance Division, they exchanged glances that suggested they thought she was exaggerating her contributions. "Supply Corps?" one asked with a knowing smirk. "Communications?" suggested another. When she explained that she had been a combat operative, the room fell silent. Then the questions started, probing and suspicious, as if they were trying to catch her in a lie. How many confirmed kills? What weapon systems had she used? Could she really have done the things her service record claimed? Sarah left the meeting early, walking through the city streets as darkness fell. The urban landscape seemed fragile and temporary, a sand castle waiting for the tide. She knew what was coming, had seen the intelligence reports that were too classified for civilian consumption. The Zephyrian Empire was regrouping, building new fleets, preparing for a final push toward Earth, and humanity was sleepwalking toward extinction, content to believe that their little corner of space would remain safe. Her phone buzzed with a message from her mother. "Dinner tomorrow with the Hendersons. They want to introduce you to their son." "He's a lawyer!" Sarah stared at the screen, feeling the gulf between her current reality and her family's expectations. They wanted her to slip back into the role of dutiful daughter, to pretend that the last 5 years had been a brief detour from a normal life. But normalcy was an illusion, a luxury that humanity could no longer afford. She thought about her unit, scattered across the galaxy on missions that would determine the fate of human civilization. Captain Rodriguez was leading a sabotage operation against a Zephyrian shipyard. Lieutenant Park was deep undercover, gathering intelligence on enemy fleet movements. They were still fighting the real war while she was trapped in a world that refused to acknowledge the danger. The irony was bitter. She had volunteered to protect Earth and its people. But those same people couldn't see past their preconceptions. To them, she was still little Sarah, the girl next door who had gone off to play soldier for a few years. The fact that she had become one of humanity's most effective weapons against an existential threat was simply incomprehensible to their civilian mindset. Walking past a recruitment center, Sarah saw posters calling for volunteers to join the defense forces. The images showed clean-cut young people in pristine uniforms, their faces bright with optimism and patriotic fervor. She remembered looking like that once, before combat had stripped away her illusions and replaced them with hard-earned wisdom. A group of teenagers stood outside the center, debating whether to enlist. They looked so young, so eager to prove themselves. Sarah wanted to warn them about what they would face, but she knew they wouldn't listen. Everyone had to learn the truth in their own way. "Excuse me, miss," one of them called out. "Are you military?" Sarah paused. "Former military." "What was it like? Did you see any action?" She studied their expectant faces, seeing herself at 18. "It changes you," she said finally. "Make sure you're ready for that." As she walked away, she could hear them discussing her words, trying to parse their meaning. They would find out soon enough. The war was coming home whether Earth was ready or not, and when it arrived, they would need soldiers who understood the true cost of survival. That night, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She couldn't return to the life her family wanted for her. Couldn't pretend to be the girl she had been, but she could prepare for what was coming, even if no one else would listen. Sarah's fingers moved across the holographic display with practiced precision, analyzing defensive positions around Earth's orbital stations. The abandoned warehouse she had converted into her private command center hummed with jury-rigged equipment salvaged from military surplus stores. For 3 months, she had been working in secret, using her savings to build something that might make a difference when the storm finally reached Earth. The intelligence networks she had cultivated during her military service still functioned, feeding her information that never made it to civilian news outlets. Zephyrian scout ships had been detected at the edge of human space. Forward bases were going dark without explanation. The enemy was probing Earth's defenses, testing response times and gathering data for a final assault. "Still playing with your toys, Sarah?" She turned to find Marcus Webb standing in the doorway, his expensive suit marking him as one of the government officials she had been trying to convince for weeks. Webb represented the Colonial Defense Committee, a bureaucratic organization that seemed more concerned with political optics than actual defense. "These aren't toys," Sarah replied, gesturing to the tactical displays. "This is a real-time analysis of enemy movement patterns and probable attack vectors. The Zephyrians are coming, Mr. Webb. The question is whether we'll be ready." Webb sighed and adjusted his tie. "Miss Chen, we appreciate your enthusiasm, but you have to understand our position. We can't justify massive defense spending based on speculation and rumors. The public demands proof of an imminent threat." "Proof?" Sarah pulled up a series of surveillance images. 3 colonies in the Tau Ceti system have gone silent in the past month. Long-range sensors detected massive energy signatures consistent with Zephyrian battle fleets. How much more proof do you need? "Correlation isn't causation," Webb said dismissively. "Those colonies could have experienced any number of problems: equipment failures, natural disasters, communication blackouts. Without concrete evidence of enemy activity, our hands are tied." Sarah felt her temper rising but kept her voice level. "I've seen their fleet compositions. I know their tactics. They're not coming to negotiate or establish trade relations. When they arrive, they will attempt to eliminate every human in the solar system." "Even if that were true," Webb continued, "what do you propose we do? You're talking about mobilizing the entire planetary defense grid based on the word of one former soldier. No offense, Miss Chen, but your military record, while impressive, doesn't qualify you to set defense policy for an entire world. The dismissal was subtle but clear. Despite her experience and proven track record, she was still being treated as an amateur playing at strategy. Sarah had faced this attitude everywhere she went, from job interviews to military briefings. Her age, gender, and civilian status combined to create a perfect storm of institutional dismissal. After Webb left, Sarah returned to her analysis, but her concentration was broken by the sound of footsteps on the warehouse stairs. She reached for the sidearm she still carried out of habit before recognizing the familiar silhouette of General Patricia Morrison, her former commanding officer. "Still working alone, I see," Morrison said, surveying the makeshift command center. "Though I have to admit, this is impressive for a one-woman operation." "General," Sarah stood at attention automatically. "I wasn't expecting you." "Relax, Chen. This isn't an official visit." Morrison moved to examine the tactical displays. "I've been following your attempts to warn the civilian authorities. Not having much luck, are you?" "They think I'm some kind of war-obsessed veteran who can't adjust to civilian life," Sarah admitted. "Every time I present evidence of the Zephyrian buildup, they find reasons to dismiss it. Too speculative, too circumstantial, too alarmist." Morrison nodded grimly. "The same thing happened before the colony wars. Intelligence services identified the threat years before the first attack. But political considerations overruled military necessity. By the time the bureaucrats acknowledged the danger, we had already lost a dozen worlds. So what can we do? Officially? Nothing. The defense budget is tied up in committee, and any military preparations would require congressional approval." Morrison paused, studying Sarah's face. "Unofficially, there are ways to prepare. Small-scale operations that don't require government oversight. Training programs for civilian volunteers. Equipment caches positioned at strategic locations. The kind of grassroots resistance network that saved humanity during the Zephyrian occupation of the outer colonies." Sarah felt a spark of hope. "You're talking about an underground resistance movement." "I'm talking about concerned citizens taking reasonable precautions for their own defense," Morrison corrected. "What they choose to do with that preparation is their own business." Over the following weeks, Sarah found herself at the center of a growing network of former military personnel, civilian volunteers, and anyone else willing to listen to her warnings. They met in basements and abandoned buildings, sharing intelligence and training in techniques that might help them survive an alien occupation. The group attracted a diverse mix of people, veterans like herself who had seen the Zephyrian threat firsthand. Scientists who understood the implications of the energy signatures detected at the edge of the system. Even some government employees who were frustrated by their superiors' inaction. But they also attracted skeptics and troublemakers. At every meeting, Sarah found herself defending not just her analysis of the threat, but her right to lead the organization. Questions about her age and experience were constant, often phrased in ways that suggested the questioners couldn't believe someone who looked so young and feminine could have achieved what her military records claimed. "I'm just saying," said Robert Kane, a former Marine sergeant, "maybe we need someone with more command experience to run this operation. No disrespect to Miss Chen. But leading a scout team isn't the same as organizing a planetary resistance movement." The comment sparked a heated debate that revealed the underlying tensions within the group. Some members supported Sarah's leadership based on her proven track record and unique experience with Zephyrian tactics. Others felt that her civilian status and relative youth made her unsuitable for such a crucial role. Sarah listened to the arguments with growing frustration. She had faced down alien shock troopers in hand-to-hand combat, infiltrated enemy strongholds, and gathered intelligence that had saved millions of lives. But to many of her own species, her greatest liability was being a young woman who didn't fit their preconceptions of what a military leader should look like. Let me tell you about command experience, she said, rising to address the room. I've led missions behind enemy lines where one mistake would have meant death or capture for my entire team. I've made life or death decisions with incomplete information and lived with the consequences. I've seen what the Zephyrians do to human prisoners, and I've done everything in my power to prevent that fate from befalling others. She moved to the tactical display, highlighting the orbital defense platforms surrounding Earth. These installations were designed to repel conventional human fleets, not Zephyrian battle groups. Their energy shields can't withstand sustained bombardment from plasma cannons. Their missile systems lack the range and targeting capability to engage enemy ships at optimal distance. When the attack comes, these platforms will be swept aside like children's toys. The room fell silent as she continued her analysis, pointing out weakness after weakness in humanity's defensive arrangements. Her knowledge was encyclopedic, her tactical insights born from hard experience. By the time she finished, even her harshest critics were listening with respect. Kane raised his hand tentatively. "What do you recommend?" Sarah smiled grimly. "We prepare for the worst. Train our people in guerrilla tactics and asymmetric warfare. Establish supply caches and communication networks that can survive orbital bombardment. Most importantly, we change the way people think about this war. The government wants to believe this is someone else's problem, that the fighting will stay in distant star systems. We need to help them understand that the war is coming home." The meeting ended with assignments distributed among the group members. Some would focus on recruiting and training new volunteers. Others would work on establishing secure communication networks. A few would attempt to influence government officials through back channels and personal connections. Sarah took on the most dangerous task, gathering real-time intelligence on Zephyrian fleet movements. Using contacts from her military service, she began assembling a picture of enemy preparations that was far more detailed than anything available to civilian authorities. The data was terrifying in its implications. Zephyrian battle groups were massing at strategic jump points, positioning themselves for a coordinated assault on the Sol system. Their fleet composition included new ship classes that intelligence services had never encountered before. Most ominously, intercepted communications suggested they were planning something beyond a simple military conquest. Sarah shared her findings with General Morrison, who confirmed the worst fears. "They're not just planning to occupy Earth," Morrison explained during a clandestine meeting. "The communications we've decoded suggest they intend to implement what they call the final protocol. Complete sterilization of all human life in the system." "Genocide," Sarah whispered. "Extinction," Morrison corrected. "They view humanity as a contamination that must be eliminated completely. No prisoners, no survivors, no possibility of future resistance. When they come, they're coming to end us as a species." The revelation changed everything for Sarah's resistance network. They were no longer preparing to resist an occupation force, but to survive an extermination campaign. The stakes couldn't be higher, and time was running out. But even as the evidence mounted, the civilian authorities remained in denial. Sarah's warnings were dismissed as fear-mongering. Her intelligence reports were classified as unreliable. Her requests for government support were buried in bureaucratic red tape. The most frustrating part was the way her own family continued to treat her as if she were overreacting to imaginary threats. During a tense dinner conversation, her father had suggested she seek counseling for what he called adjustment disorder. "Sweetheart," her mother had said gently, "maybe it's time to put the war behind you. Focus on building a normal life. Find someone special, maybe start a family. You can't spend the rest of your life fighting battles that may never come." Sarah had excused herself from the table, unable to explain that the battle for humanity's survival had already begun. The enemy was simply taking time to position their pieces before making their final move. Standing in her makeshift command center that night, surrounded by tactical displays and intelligence reports, Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. She was one of the few people on Earth who truly understood what was coming, and despite everything she had done, humanity remained unprepared for the storm about to break upon them. The first wave hit Earth's outer defense perimeter at 0347 local time, Pacific Standard. Sarah was already in her command center when the emergency broadcasts began, having tracked the Zephyrian fleet through its final approach for the past 18 hours. Her underground network had given her better intelligence than most government agencies, but even she was unprepared for the scale of the assault. Orbital defense platforms went dark one by one as massive battle cruisers emerged from hyperspace. The energy signatures were unlike anything in the intelligence files, suggesting the Zephyrians had deployed new weapon systems specifically designed for this final campaign. Sarah watched helplessly as humanity's first line of defense crumbled in less than 20 minutes. Her secure communication array crackled with panicked reports from resistance cells across the globe. Tokyo was under bombardment. London had gone dark. The European defense grid was reporting massive casualties and system failures across all sectors. This wasn't the gradual conquest that military planners had anticipated, but a coordinated extinction event. "Command, this is Delta 7, came a voice through the static. "We're seeing massive energy discharges over the eastern seaboard. The atmospheric readings are off the charts. Whatever they're using, it's not conventional plasma bombardment." Sarah pulled up atmospheric monitoring data from scientific stations worldwide. The readings were indeed anomalous, showing energy patterns that suggested the Zephyrians were using some kind of atmospheric processing weapon. She had seen similar signatures during the massacre at New Terra, where the aliens had turned a thriving colony world into a sterile wasteland in less than 6 hours. The final protocol was beginning. Her family lived in a suburban area that would be a low-priority target, but Sarah knew that wouldn't matter once the atmospheric processing began. The Zephyrian weapons didn't discriminate between military and civilian targets. They were designed to eliminate all organic life on a planetary scale. She tried calling her parents' house, but the communication networks were already overloaded. Emergency services were broadcasting evacuation orders, but there was nowhere to evacuate to. The Zephyrian fleet controlled orbital space, and their ground forces would soon begin landing in major population centers. "Sarah?" The voice belonged to Tom Bradley, her old prom date who had joined the resistance network despite his initial skepticism. He burst into the command center with a group of other volunteers, their faces grim with determination and fear. "We're getting reports of landing craft in Central Park. They're not waiting for orbital bombardment to finish before deploying ground forces." Sarah nodded, her mind already shifting to combat mode. This was what she had trained for during 5 years behind enemy lines. Urban warfare against a technologically superior foe with overwhelming numerical advantage. The tactics were familiar, even if the scale was unprecedented. "Activate all resistance cells," she ordered. "Implement Protocol 7, hit-and-run tactics only. We're not trying to win pitched battles. Just slow them down and gather intelligence on their capabilities." Tom stared at her, seeing something in her expression that hadn't been there during their casual encounters around town. The suburban facade was gone, replaced by the cold calculation of a seasoned combat veteran. For the first time, he understood that the woman he had dismissed as Little Sarah was something far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. "What about evacuation?" asked Jennifer Park, a computer programmer who had been working on secure communication protocols. "Shouldn't we be helping people get to safety?" "There is no safety," Sarah replied bluntly. "The Zephyrians aren't here to occupy territory or extract resources. They're here to eliminate every human in the solar system. Our only option is to make them pay such a high price that they'll think twice before trying this again on another world." The next few hours were chaos. Sarah coordinated resistance activities across multiple time zones, while government authorities struggled to mount any coherent response. Regular military units were designed for conventional warfare, not the kind of asymmetric campaign that might have a chance against Zephyrian forces. Reports flooded in from resistance cells that had made contact with the enemy. The ground forces were different from the ones Sarah remembered from the colony wars, more heavily armored and equipped with weapons that seemed designed specifically for urban combat. The Zephyrians had been planning this assault for years, adapting their tactics based on human resistance techniques observed during previous campaigns. But they had also underestimated human adaptability. Sarah's training program had focused on exactly this scenario, preparing civilian volunteers for combat against technologically superior aliens. While regular forces were being overwhelmed by unfamiliar tactics, the resistance cells were implementing strategies specifically designed to exploit Zephyrian weaknesses. "Command, this is Alpha 3, reported Maria Santos, a former Air Force pilot who now led a resistance cell in downtown Los Angeles. "We've confirmed that their battle armor has the same vulnerability we identified during the colony campaigns. Focused electromagnetic pulses can disrupt their energy shields long enough for conventional weapons to penetrate." Sarah smiled grimly. It was the first good news she had received all day. "Understood, Alpha 3. Distribute that intelligence to all cells. Priority transmission." Her secure communication network had become the de facto command structure for human resistance efforts. Government communications were being jammed or intercepted, but the low-tech systems Sarah had insisted on were proving remarkably resilient. Ham radio operators, encrypted text messages, even primitive signal fires were keeping resistance cells connected when high-tech alternatives failed. The irony was bitter. For months, officials had dismissed her preparations as amateurish and unnecessary. Now those same preparations were the only thing keeping human resistance coordinated in the face of total governmental collapse. Her personal communicator buzzed with an incoming message from General Morrison. The transmission was brief and coded, but its meaning was clear. Regular military forces were falling back to predetermined strongholds, leaving civilian populations to fend for themselves. The government was implementing a strategy of strategic withdrawal, hoping to preserve enough military capability for a counterattack once Zephyrian forces were fully committed to occupation duties. Sarah stared at the message for a long moment before deleting it. She understood the strategic logic, but she couldn't abandon the people she had sworn to protect. The resistance would hold the line, even if it meant sacrificing themselves to buy time for others to escape. "Tom, I need you to coordinate evacuation efforts for non-combatants," she said. "Focus on children and elderly first. Get them to the mountain shelters we identified during planning sessions." "What about you?" Tom asked. Sarah was already pulling on body armor and checking her weapons. "I'm going to visit my parents." The drive through suburban streets was surreal. Emergency broadcasts played on every radio station, but the neighborhood still looked normal. Families were loading cars with hastily packed belongings, but there was no real panic yet. Most people still believed this was a temporary crisis that would be resolved by government forces. Sarah knew better. She had seen what happened when the Zephyrians decided to eliminate a human population. The atmospheric processing weapons were already changing the chemical composition of Earth's air, making it gradually toxic to human life. In 48 hours, maybe less, breathing would become difficult even with protective equipment. Her parents' house was exactly as she remembered it, a small island of normalcy in an increasingly chaotic world. Her mother answered the door with a relieved smile that faded when she saw Sarah's military gear and grim expression. "Sarah, thank goodness you're safe. Your father was just saying we should try to find you and, Mom, we need to leave. Now." Sarah pushed past her into the house, where her father and brother were watching news coverage of the attacks. The reporters were still talking about isolated incidents and measured government response, completely failing to grasp the scope of the crisis. "Sweetheart, you look terrible," her mother said. "Come sit down, have some tea. I'm sure this will all blow over soon." "The military will handle it," Sarah wanted to scream. Even now, with alien ships burning cities across the globe, her family couldn't see past their preconceptions. To them, she was still the daughter who needed protection and comfort, not the seasoned warrior who had come to save their lives. "The military is gone," she said flatly. "Regular forces are falling back to defensive positions. Orbital defenses are destroyed. The aliens are implementing something called the Final Protocol, which means they intend to eliminate all human life on this planet." Her father muted the television and turned to face her. "Sarah, you're scaring your mother. I know you have military experience, but surely you're overreacting. This is just another conflict. Governments fight wars all the time." "This isn't a war." Sarah's control finally snapped. "This is extermination. I've seen what they do to human colonies. I've studied their tactics and technology for 5 years. They're not here to conquer or negotiate. They're here to make sure humanity never threatens them again, by wiping us out completely." The room fell silent, except for the drone of news coverage. Her family stared at her with a mixture of fear and disbelief, still unable to reconcile the intense woman before them with their memories of a gentle daughter and sister. "Even if that's true," her brother David said carefully, "what can we do about it? We're not soldiers." Sarah pulled out a detailed evacuation plan she had prepared months earlier. "I've identified several secure locations in the mountains where you can wait out the initial assault. I've cached supplies and equipment at each site. If you leave now, you can reach the first waypoint before the atmospheric processing makes surface travel impossible." Her mother shook her head stubbornly. "I'm not leaving my home because of some wild theory. This is where we belong, where we've built our lives. Whatever happens, we'll face it together as a family." Sarah looked around the room, at the family photos and comfortable furniture that represented everything she had fought to protect. For a moment she wavered, tempted to stay and defend this small piece of normalcy against the approaching storm. But she knew it would be futile. The house would be ash within hours, and her family would be dead. "I can't force you to come with me," she said finally. "But I can't stay here and watch you die either. I have other people counting on me. People who understand what we're facing and are willing to fight for survival." As she turned to leave, her mother grabbed her arm. "Please, sweetheart, don't go. We can work through this together as a family. You don't have to carry the world on your shoulders." Sarah gently freed herself from her mother's grip. "Someone has to," she said, "and it looks like that someone is me." The last thing she heard as she walked away was her father calling after her, "Sarah, wait! Come back! You're still just a girl." Just a girl. The words followed her as she drove back toward the city, where Zephyrian forces were already establishing control points and beginning the systematic elimination of human resistance. She thought about all the times she had heard similar dismissals, all the ways people had tried to reduce her to something small and manageable. But as she coordinated the desperate defense of humanity's homeworld, Sarah Chen was no longer just a girl. She was something the Zephyrians had never encountered before, a human being who refused to accept extinction as inevitable, and that perhaps would make all the difference in the war to come.